History is not a simple narrative of good versus evil. It is an iterative cycle of power, control, and reaction. When great powers intervene in the development of emerging nations, they often create the very forces that ultimately define their adversaries. This dynamic, driven by the constraints of resource competition and Cold War ideology, is the central pattern in the relationship between the United States and Iran. For 70 years, this relationship has moved through distinct phases: partnership, betrayal, revolution, and sustained shadow war. But the rupture point, the wound that has never fully healed, was a contest over sovereignty, disguised as a fight against communism. It was a failure to respect national aspiration that guaranteed decades of lasting hostility. Today, the conflict spans proxy forces, nuclear negotiations, and global sanctions. Yet, to understand the present containment strategy, we must first examine the foundation of distrust laid down not in Tehran's revolutionary streets, but in the oil fields of the early 20th century. Before the hostility, there was alignment. Following the forced abdication of Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1941, his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, ascended to the throne. This monarchy, heavily reliant on Western support, represented the existing order. Its foundation was the vast Iranian oil wealth, but this wealth did not flow to the Iranian people. For decades, British interests, formalized by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, controlled the entire extraction process. The concession terms were exploitative, often ensuring that Iran received a mere fraction, sometimes cited around 16% of the profits. More critically, the company consistently refused auditing, locking Iran out of understanding its own resource value. This lack of sovereignty created deep structural weakness. Iranian nationalists, religious figures, and the secular political class were united by a single objective: reclaiming national resources. The stage was set for a systemic challenge to the established order, a challenge that Washington and London would interpret not as a nationalist movement, but as a strategic threat. The system was challenged in 1951 by the rise of Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh. He was the central actor of his time, driven by an unyielding mandate: oil nationalization. Mossadegh's success was immediate and overwhelming, receiving unanimous parliamentary approval. He became the face of Iranian sovereignty, an existential threat to British economic control. Britain responded with a devastating naval blockade and a global boycott, starving Iran of oil revenue. This economic decay created the leverage necessary for external intervention. The United States, concerned about Mossadegh's openness to collaboration with the local Communist Tudeh Party, chose to prioritize Cold War containment over democratic principles. In August 1953, the CIA and MI6 executed Operation Ajax. It was a swift, calculated, and highly effective intervention. Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah was returned to absolute power, backed by U.S. military aid and intelligence training. This single decision did more than restore a monarch. It fundamentally poisoned the U.S. reputation. It taught generations of Iranians a potent lesson: that internal democracy was expendable when weighed against Western strategic interests. The consequences of Operation Ajax unfolded slowly over 25 years. The Shah instituted the White Revolution, a top-down modernization of land reform and secular expansion. But these reforms were coupled with the brutal repression of the SAVAK secret police. The opposition was not singular. It was a coalition of urban intellectuals, liberal Democrats, and religious clergy, all united against authoritarianism and perceived subordination to the West. The Shah's forced reliance on U.S. support became his fatal weakness. The exiled Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini emerged as the central counterforce, framing the conflict not as political opposition, but as a holy struggle against the U.S., the Great Satan. When the system finally collapsed in 1979, The resulting Islamic Republic was inherently ideological and anti-Western. The capture of the U.S. Embassy and the 444-day hostage crisis was not a spontaneous act. It was the ultimate cathartic rejection of the U.S. role in 1953. Diplomatic relations froze completely, and the conflict transitioned from proxy control to existential opposition. The new regime was tested immediately by the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein's invasion in 1980 was enabled by the chaos of the revolution. The U.S., seeking to contain and weaken the newly hostile Islamic Republic, provided crucial intelligence and materiel support to Iraq. This deepened the Iranian perception of perpetual U.S. hostility. This 8-year war expanded into a critical naval confrontation in the Persian Gulf. By 1988, the conflict escalated sharply. Iran targeted international shipping, attempting to cripple the flow of Iraqi oil. The U.S., acting to protect neutral shipping, increasingly engaged the Iranian military directly. This shadow war culminated in Operation Praying Mantis, the largest U.S. naval combat operation since World War II, launched after an Iranian mine struck the USS Samuel B. Roberts. In the intense, volatile environment of the Gulf, a devastating miscalculation occurred. On July 3, 1988, the U.S. guided missile cruiser USS Vincennes mistakenly identified an Iranian civilian airliner, Iran Air Flight 655, as a hostile fighter jet. The cruiser shot down the plane, killing all 290 people on board. It was a tragic, instantaneous consequence of military tension and high alert. The downing of Flight 655 became an indelible symbol of American arrogance and lethal power in the eyes of the Iranian leadership. Although the U.S. later paid $131 million in compensation to the victims' families, it did so ex gratia, a voluntary gesture that avoided any admission of lethal wrongdoing or formal apology. For Iran, it was definitive proof that the United States considered Iranian civilian life secondary to its strategic regional objectives. This period resolved nothing strategically, but it cemented the new balance of power. The U.S. was the dominant naval force, and Iran was forced to pivot toward asymmetric proxy warfare. Unable to defeat the U.S. conventionally, Iran invested heavily in regional non-state actors like Hezbollah and Shiite militias in Iraq, ensuring its influence could not be contained by traditional military means. The initial betrayal of 1953 established the context for ideological revolution. The 1988 tragedy established the rules of engagement for the subsequent shadow war. The pattern persists. Intervention breeds resistance. Resistance forces military escalation, and escalation results in unintended catastrophic consequences. This cycle ensures that even moments of diplomatic breakthrough, like the 2015 nuclear deal, remain fragile, always vulnerable to the deep historical wound of strategic distrust.